Yep, that's correct. Sorry, I'm on the phone with one of those 1-800 fortune teller numbers. And quite honestly, with the way the football season has gone so far, maybe this is the type of help we need to get the rest of the way through the season. Because, yep, that'd be correct. 5.89 a minute? All right, yeah, let's go for it. My credit card number is 473. Helliner Nation, welcome back to the Draft.com studios. Kyle coming to you for quarterbacks start and sit week 6 of the football season. And before we get rolling into this show, we have a ton of information, but it's really important to note. Let me have a couple of minutes of your time. Don't go skipping ahead just yet. Let me explain real quick what we are looking at in week 6. This is a really vital week. We have 4 teams that are on byes this week. We've had a lot of inconsistencies. So before you skip ahead to any of the matchups, let me explain a little bit in terms of what I see for this coming week for the quarterback position overall. Before we do that, though, we got to be transparent like we are in every single episode, and we got to talk about our hits and misses. Real quick, there are the hits and misses for week 5. That's 66%. We've talked about it. We would love to be a little bit closer to 70%. We are right on the mark there. But where it really matters in our rankings, another solid week for the fantasy headliners. I'm coming in right now out of 153 people, 37th overall for all positions. I'm up to 16th overall for quarterbacks, and I'm at first overall for tight ends. So the rankings have been on point this season. And even though we haven't quite hit that 70% mark on our hits or on our starts and sits on a consistent basis, we're still making really good calls on the show, people. So continue to tune in, continue to move forward with those lineups. But for week 6, now week 6, I am very concerned about the quarterback position. I have a lot of sits this week. And for that to happen in a week when we have 4 teams on byes, it might seem a little bit odd. But there's going to be some really top-heavy guys, some guys that are going to probably score a ton of points this week, and then there are going to be a lot of guys who aren't going to hit those 18% or those 18 points that we use as the cutoff for starts and sits. So even though I might list somebody as a sit in this episode, they might actually still be a guy that you are going to put into your lineup because you might not have any other choice. I just don't feel they're going to hit that 18-point cutoff that we use to determine starts and sits. So it is very important that you take in everything from this show because this is where we dive deep into the matchup. The ranking show is where we hit things really quick, reinforce where we're at the end of the week with our rankings. So make sure you utilize both of these videos to make your calls this week, especially if you have 1 or 2 quarterbacks that you're deciding between. With that being said, we need to get rolling now. Let's start it up for week 6. Quarterbacks start and sit. First game of the week, the New York Giants at the New England Patriots on Thursday Night Football. And Tom Brady, I'll start him this week. He's a safe play, probably one of the safest quarterbacks of the slate this week. He's going to get his 18 points. This is a defense that they're definitely going to be able to throw on early. But the often part is the question, because if New England can run away with this game early and then focus on the run game the rest of the way, Brady might not see nearly the type of volume needed to be the top end quarterback this week. I've got him about a mid QB1 this week is kind of what I'm looking at because I think he loses a lot of that upside. On the other hand, with Daniel Jones, he's got no upside this week. No upside and probably one of the lowest floors of the slate. He's heading into Foxborough with no Evan Ingram, no Sterling Shepard, no Saquon Barkley, and no Wayne Gallman. He's missing all of his offensive weapons outside of Golden Tate. So who's he going to have to throw to? That's going to be an issue. Not only that, but he's going to be facing a New England Patriots defense that's giving up just over 5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, the lowest in the NFL. They are also giving up the lowest amount of passing yards in the NFL. This defense has been spectacular so far this season. It doesn't get any easier for them on Thursday Night Football. The Giants and Daniel Jones are going to be better moving forward, but they have to get healthy. That's the biggest issue for them, being on the road this week on an early game, having to play on Thursday night on little rest. I'm not interested in playing any of them really this week. Stay away from the offense and move forward with other options. Our London game this week is going to be the Panthers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And speaking from a pure football standpoint, throwing fantasy football out the window, Kyle Allen, he hasn't been that bad this year. He's been just good enough to help this team win. He's done just enough. But this week, a game in London, he hasn't really had the upside this season to play for fantasy football. So even though he's been good from a football standpoint, as fantasy football owners, he hasn't had any upside for us. Expect a lot of Christian McCaffrey this week, and we're just going to go ahead and leave Kyle Allen on the bench, even though this is a matchup that could be one of the better ones he sees this season. Now for Tampa Bay and Jameis Winston, I am going to run back out there this week. Now he scared a few of you to begin the game last week, but he ended up finishing all right. He did exactly what he was supposed to. He just didn't have nearly the upside last week that I was hoping. But since week 1, his touchdown to interception ratio right now is 9-2. He's been playing well. He's still getting a ton of hate because we're seeing these offensive weapons be really inconsistent, like Mike Evans putting up a 0 last week. Winston is still getting some of the blame for that, but he actually hasn't been playing that bad. Now, this matchup against Carolina, again, just like Tom Brady, a little bit different with the game scenario. I'm just not seeing the upside this week because this is going to be a tougher defense. He's going to have to throw enough. I definitely think he's a start because he's going to get his 18 points necessary to be a start. But again, I think there's going to be a limited ceiling with him this week. A lot of tough matchups. Jameis Winston, though, will be one of the better starts this week. All right, the Seattle Seahawks will head to Cleveland this week as Cleveland looks to bounce back from an awful performance on Monday Night Football against the San Francisco 49ers. Now, you're probably going to be questioning why I have Baker Mayfield as a start and some of these other guys as a sit. I'm feeling a bounce back performance this week. But first, Russell Wilson. Talking about Russell Wilson, he's the quarterback 2 right now. He's playing just as well as anybody in the league. Definitely an MVP candidate. He's a guy that we're starting every single week. Cleveland hasn't been bad against the pass this year. It's the run that they've had a lot of trouble with. But against the pass, they've done fairly well, which is odd because they've been missing 2 of their top cornerbacks or they've been banged up. So are their cornerbacks going to be healthy this week? Doesn't really matter for me. If they're out, Russell Wilson has an even higher ceiling. If they're in, he's still a start. He's a safe play. Now, let's talk about Baker Mayfield here for a second. Seattle is giving up over 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterback right now. And one of the things that I expect to happen this week is that Seattle is going to run the ball a ton. Now, Seattle's running the ball a ton against a Cleveland defense that's had some trouble stopping the run. If they were to do that, they're going to limit some of that clock. So Baker Mayfield and the offense are going to have to come out, and they're going to have to run some hurry-up offense. I expect to see some of that happening. They're going to be back in Cleveland this week. They're going to need that energy from the crowd. They're going to need to feed off it. I think he gets back on track. And I just want to mention something that I posted on Twitter. A lot of you are jumping off the Baker Mayfield bandwagon. As far as this season goes, if you don't trust him right now, I don't blame you. If you sit him this week, I don't blame you. If you drop him, I don't blame you. But just to point something out, these are stats from the first 5 games the year after they took over as the full-time starter. Baker Mayfield this season through his first 5 games, 90 for 161, 55% completion percentage, 1,247 yards, 4 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. The year after Brett Favre took over as the full-time starter for the Green Bay Packers, 92 of 153, 60% completion percentage, 937 yards, 5 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. I am not comparing Baker Mayfield to Brett Favre at all. This is me saying that we give up on guys way too quickly sometimes. Can you imagine if we would have given up on Brett Favre at this point? Baker Mayfield deserves all the criticism. He's brought that upon himself by running his mouth this offseason, but that's just who he is. But sometimes players, they just start slow. Sometimes they look good and then they don't look great after it. So with that being said, let's give Baker Mayfield some more time before we jump ship completely and see if him and this offense can get things turned around this season. The number one priority is adding an offensive lineman very, very quickly though, because that offensive line sucks. If you needed one game to watch this Sunday, this is going to be the one that will be the most fun to watch. Houston is headed to Kansas City. We've got two of the best quarterbacks in the league, two of the best younger quarterbacks in the league, the quarterback 3 in Deshaun Watson, the quarterback 4 in Patrick Mahomes. Both of these defenses are giving up over 18 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. There's going to be a whole lot of fantasy points for both of these quarterbacks in this matchup. I know Kansas City hasn't looked great the last couple of weeks, but again, like I said, I'm not jumping off bandwagons too quickly. Patrick Mahomes and this team will get it rolling back on track pretty soon. Tyreek Hill could be back pretty soon. That will give a boost to the offense. But any way it goes, there's going to be a lot of fantasy points this week, and this will be two of the top quarterbacks on the slate and two of the top quarterbacks in my rankings. Washington at Miami. No. Hell no. Just forget about it. All right, here's the first game of the week that we're probably going to get some questions about. Philadelphia Eagles fans, stay with me for a second. I don't hate Carson Wentz. I just don't like his upside this week. I am really concerned about him getting to 18 fantasy points. However, if you have him, he's the quarterback 7 this season. If you don't have better options, you throw him out there. You do not have a choice, okay? Just keep an eye on him in my rankings. He might be a little bit lower because I don't love the upside this week. But let's talk about it for a second. Kirk Cousins first. Okay, he's going to be a start for me. We saw some life from Cousins last week. 22 of 27, 306 yards, 2 touchdowns. This is a good opportunity for him. Philadelphia is giving up 27 or more points, or has given up 27 or more points in all but one game this season, and they've given up the 4th most passing yards. So Kirk Cousins definitely has an opportunity to continue to stay on track and get this offense moving in the right direction. Now let's talk about Carson Wentz. Minnesota's played 2 games at home this season. Combined in those 2 games, the opposing team has only scored 26 points. Minnesota has allowed the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks and the 6th fewest passing yards in the league. Wentz has not thrown for over 300 yards since week 1, and over the last 2 games, he's combined for 349 yards. He's playing very well. Do not get me wrong. From a pure football standpoint, again, like I've talked about before, from a pure football standpoint, he's playing just fine. He looks good. He looks like the quarterback that he used to be. The volume just hasn't been there yet. And because of that, I think this is going to be a tough week for the Eagles. I definitely think they have a chance to go into Minnesota and win. I do think Minnesota ends up winning this game, but I think we're just going to see some limited points from Carson Wentz. I don't love his upside this week. I liked him last week. I gave him credit last week. I said, let's roll with it. This week, however, I'm not going to say that I'm hating on him. I just don't love him this week. But if you have him, more than likely you're going to be starting him. Just limit your expectations in week 6. Teddy Bridgewater, coming off a huge game, his best game of the season last week, is still not going to be enough for me to label him as a start this week against Jacksonville. Gardner Minshew, though, we've already said it. He is a perma start moving forward at this point. The kid's been, how can you say he's been better than expected? Because there was no expectations for him to begin the year. So he has been fantastic, though. The Saints are giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks right now. He has not thrown an interception since week 1, and he has thrown at least 2 touchdowns in all but 1 game. Minshew Mania, it's going to continue into week 6. Now, for Teddy Bridgewater, again, not loving the matchup this week. He had a really good matchup. He had a really good game last week against a team that he probably should have had a really good game against. Bridgewater right now is only averaging 11.8 fantasy points per game this season. He had the big game against Tampa Bay, but prior to that, he was only averaging 178 yards per game, and he only had 2 touchdowns prior to that. So even though he had a really good game last week, I just don't see it translating on the road this week to Jacksonville. I think there's potential safer options out there that you could grab this week instead of trying to get clever with it and starting Teddy Bridgewater. The only reason you're starting Bridgewater, again, is if you absolutely have no other choice. But I still would suggest you go to the waiver wire and see if there's someone else there that you could play instead. So in this matchup, interdivision matchup, Cincinnati and Baltimore, I've got both of these quarterbacks as a start. Lamar Jackson first. He's been a little bit more inconsistent in the passing game. Since week 1, when he really looked good, he's been kind of inconsistent, but he's still the quarterback 1 for fantasy points right now. And running the ball, since week one, running the football, he is averaging 11 rushing attempts and 7 rushing yards per game. So he's using his legs. Week 1, it didn't look like he would be. He's begun doing it since then. Cincinnati is giving up the second most rushing yards to opposing quarterbacks. So Lamar Jackson, based on that alone, is going to have a ton of upside this week. Now, talking about Andy Dalton, Baltimore has given up the second most pass yards in the NFL. Now, they haven't given up a ton of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, though, because they're limiting the amount of scores. They've only given up 6 passing touchdowns this season. That's why they haven't given up a ton of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. It's only 16 fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks right now. So they've done a good job of limiting, even though it's been a bend, don't break type atmosphere for that defense on the on the passing side of the football this year, because they're giving up the yards. They're just not giving up the scores. Dalton's probably going to be passing a lot in this game. There's going to be a ton of volume. He's going to have the opportunity. So if he could throw 2 touchdowns, he's going to build up enough yards on the volume alone to definitely get to 18 points. He's probably a streaming option because more than likely he's still going to be sitting on waivers for a lot of you. So if there's some of you that just don't see the upside this week, Andy Dalton could have the upside that you would need if you have to have that in your lineup. San Francisco at the Los Angeles Rams, and I don't like this matchup for either quarterback. And I will say this. I sat and I stared at this game for probably 30 minutes, going through different stats, replaying through them, writing things down, talking about it through my head. This game alone, going through it, was probably 30 to 45 minutes on its own, trying to decide what I wanted to do here. I kept going back and forth, and I finally landed on sit. Jimmy Garoppolo, if he hit his 18 points, I would not be surprised. I am worried about Jared Goff a little bit more, though. For Jimmy Garoppolo, the game script could end up being there if the Rams can score on the 49ers. But how good is that 49ers defense? San Francisco is the only team outside of New England to allow less than 10 points per game to opposing quarterbacks. So only 2 teams, New England, San Francisco, allowing less than 10 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. This is the week we find out if the San Francisco D is legit, though. If it is legit, this is going to be a defensive game. This is going to be tough for both offenses to score. Brandon Cooks isn't going to be playing this week, it sounds like. So because of that, they're going to be down an offensive weapon. I'm just really concerned with this game in terms of becoming a defensive battle in Los Angeles. I don't think there's any upside for either of these quarterbacks. For that to happen, basically, we'd have to say San Francisco's defense isn't what we thought it had been. Los Angeles is going to put up some points on them, and then San Francisco is going to have to throw it a ton to stay in the game. If not, we're going to see a lot of running the football this week. Outside of Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson in their matchup, the other 2 quarterbacks that I feel have the highest ceiling are going to be Kyler Murray and Matt Ryan. They are both starts in this game, and I would honestly expect a ton of points, because both of these quarterbacks are going to be throwing a lot, and they are going to be putting together some great numbers this week. Both of these teams are top 4 in most points allowed, most fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. Both of these defenses have given up 12 passing touchdowns this season, second most in the league. Both of these defenses are top 5 in most points allowed. If you're going to find a mess of a game on the defensive side of the ball, it's going to be this game. Neither of these teams are going to be able to stop each other. There's going to be a whole lot of fantasy points put up in this game. A lot of it's going to come from the quarterback position. Matt Ryan, Kyler Murray, 2 of my highest upside plays of the week, and what could potentially be one of, if not the highest scoring game of the week. From what could be one of the best games to watch to one of the possible worst games to watch. Marcus Mariota, Joe Flacco. This is going to be a defensive struggle. I don't see a whole lot of fantasy points being put up from any position this week outside of Derrick Henry. The Titans are giving up 15 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. The Broncos are giving up 10 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. But the problem is they're top 4 in most fantasy points allowed to running backs. So Derrick Henry is going to be running all over the place in this game. Absolutely no upside for Marcus Mariota. If you need to stream somebody, you could look at Joe Flacco potentially and say, hey, if Tennessee can go into Denver and really run up the score and keep the ball on the ground, again, like I talked about with an earlier matchup, if they're going to be running the ball a lot, Joe Flacco is going to have to come up. They're going to have to hurry up that offense. He's going to have to throw a lot. I just don't see it this week. I don't think either of these options are going to be good bets for you, so I would shy away from them in week 6. Another matchup with a quarterback that I'm going to start, but could be limited in terms of upside. Again, you're seeing a trend this week, right? Lots of matchups where we could see limited upside. This could be a really low scoring week for quarterbacks. That's very concerning. However, with Dak Prescott, I'm going to still continue to list him as a start. Now, the Jets defense, it has not been bad this year. They've looked decent. They've looked good at times. They could give the Dallas Cowboys some troubles at home this week. So keep an eye on this matchup. Dak is still going to be a start. The offense has come back down to earth since the first few games of the season, but there's only been 1 week that Dak Prescott hasn't been a top 10 quarterback. So we're going to roll him out as a start again this week. Sam Darnold. I know a lot of you are excited to get him back, especially if you were relying on him. And he's probably on the waiver wire right now. And he could be in an upcoming show when we talk about guys that you're going to want to grab before the stretch. So with Sam Darnold, it's not going to be a start for me this week, though. His first week back, Dallas is only giving up 11.75 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's the 6th fewest in the National Football League. I'm just not loving the game this week for him, especially his first week back. Let's get him healthy, back into the mold of things, going again. We got to get him back up to game speed and make sure that he's 100% healthy against a little bit worse defense, and then we'll start to play him a little bit more. But his end of the season schedule looks juicy. Keep an eye on that. Pittsburgh at the Los Angeles Chargers, and I was so looking forward to listing Mason Rudolph as a start again, but unfortunately that scary hit he took last week, he will not be playing this week. In his place, Devlin Hodges. Los Angeles is giving up less than 15 fantasy points per game. You've got an undrafted free agent coming in, starting his first game. I'm just not loving it. Even though he's got a lot of weapons around him, I'm expecting a lot of James Conner this week. I just don't see nearly enough upside and nearly enough volume for Hodges to be a start. Phillip Rivers, on the other hand, I'm going to list him as a start. I think this is also another matchup where we see a lot of limited upside. Yes, he probably hits his 18 points. I don't think he goes much higher than that, though. If for some reason Pittsburgh has issues moving the football and they can't do much, he could have some really good field position. It could lead to some touchdowns for him. However, yards, if they are able to pull away from Pittsburgh a little bit more at home, I could see some Melvin Gordon, Austin Eckler this week as well. So again, I'm going to start Phillip Rivers, but another matchup with limited upside. All right, my second what the of the evening. With this matchup, Detroit Lions at Green Bay, Monday Night Football. Matthew Stafford is going to be a start for me. He's been fantastic. As a Lions fan, I can't be any happier with his performance. He's really, really starting to put some of those doubters. He's starting to quiet them down a little bit. I hope he continues to do that. Love Matthew Stafford. But from a fantasy football standpoint, this is always a good matchup. When these two teams get together, a lot of crazy things can happen. We've seen some Aaron Rodgers Hail Marys. I don't know if we'll see that again this week. However, Matthew Stafford on the road, I'm still going to take him. MVP caliber season. He's the quarterback. He's a quarterback 8 right now based on fantasy points per game. He fell a little bit because of their bye last week, but fantasy points per game, he's number 8 right now. He could hit that 18 pretty easily. We'll see what happens with this defense. They've looked a little bit human over the last couple of weeks. They looked a lot better against Dallas. We'll see what happens on the road, but Matthew Stafford is going to be a start for me. Aaron Rodgers is going to be a sit. Now, if you own Aaron Rodgers, you're going to start Aaron Rodgers. You're not going to put him on the bench. However, again, our breakoff, our percentage, 18 fantasy points. I don't think Aaron Rodgers gets to 18 fantasy points this week. He's been very underwhelming so far this season. Limited upside because Detroit is giving up the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. We're going to see a lot of Aaron Jones again this week, people. If you own Aaron Jones, put him in your lineup because he is going to be a huge asset for you this week. But that's going to take away a lot of what Aaron Rodgers could do. Detroit limited Patrick Mahomes a couple of weeks ago. At home, they made Patrick Mahomes look human, which he very rarely ever looks human. Also, the Detroit defense has only given up 4 passing touchdowns this year. So I just don't see it with Aaron Rodgers this week against Detroit. I see a very, very limited floor for him as well. If he's around that 10, 11, 12 area, I don't doubt that. but I don't know if he finds the end zone this week. I think he has to find the end zone twice to get 18 fantasy points. I see a lot of limited upside. I see a lot of troubles for him coming up against this defense, and I see a ton of Aaron Jones, which is going to hurt him. Headliner Nation, there you have it. Week 6, start and sit for quarterbacks in the books. This is the episode, again, where we do a little bit more deep diving. We talk a little bit more about the stats, but you're going to have to really use this episode and the rankings episode in conjunction this week because, as I mentioned at the beginning, and you saw throughout this episode, if you watched the entire episode, that there is several quarterbacks with a high upside this week. And then we have basically the rest of the quarterback pool with very limited upside this week. I think it's going to be a difficult week for quarterbacks. I think we're going to see a lot of low scoring options from quarterbacks this week. Very, very tough. However, if you own guys like Carson Wentz and Aaron Rodgers, I listed them as sits because I don't think they hit 18 points. However, you probably don't have anyone else to play. So you're going to have to start them. With that being said, just limit your expectations this week and understand your fantasy points will probably need to come from somebody else. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Fantasy Headliners. If you are not a part of Headliner Nation yet, hit that subscribe button below, turn on the bell notifications. Every time that we go live, Saturday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, make sure you tune into those. Or every time we drop content, you'll be notified right away. Also, like the video if you appreciated the content. And as always, leave a comment below. Thanks so much, Headliner Nation. I'll see you on the next episode.